see that. It's me right there. Oh, it's me right there. Dead center. Up at Shinnecock in Long Island. With my groove on. Oh yeah. That's me right there. Right. Anyway, enough of that. Osio, Toichu. Hello, Hannah, how are you? Welcome to another edition of Chief Eagle Spirit Dancing. Um, the topic of this lecture is the relationship between blacks and Indians and indoctrination. Yeah, hold on to your seats. It's going to be a nice little ride. I came into some information the other day with regards to one called um, AKA Geronimo um, Gayote, should I say, his original name. This is in regards to his imprisonment by a colonel whose name was Francis Pratt, who initially founded the uh, the military prisons for indigenous peoples, and particularly one in Florida that he resided over with Geronimo, and he headed up the one that was initially started in the late 1870s, I believe, early 1880s, called the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania. Uh, the military prisons, if you will, most people don't really know too much with regards to the history of the indigenous Indians that were not only removed from their indigenous lands, but they were not put on reservations because they were deemed a serious threat. So they were put into prisons and they were tortured. Sound familiar? Yeah. This is rarely spoken of, and not too many people even know of this particular history. And you say, what does this have to do with black people and Indians and indoctrination? Oh, oh, I'm gonna get there. Just stay with me. You can go back as far as the brother, what's his name? Bear with me a minute. Having a relapse here. Sometimes my memory fails me. I'm getting old. Trying to remember the Indian brother's name. Oh, okay. En Matoy Alatkit, or they refer to as Chief Joseph, was shipped off, put on what they called a reservation in the east, but it was no less a prison than one made with bars. However, there were restrictions. They were confined. They couldn't go but so far off the grounds that they were designated. Their movement was limited. And depending on the level of resistance, you know, you had other chiefs who were remanded, um, besides Chief Joseph. Um, um, you can go to tribal chiefs here on the East Coast who were sent to the West Coast, and chiefs who were from the Northeast were sent to the Southeast. Chiefs who were from the Northwest were sent to the Northeast. Indians, Indian fighters, if you will, or soldiers, if you will, that came from different not ethnic, excuse me, temperature zones, if you will. Of course, here in the Northeast, you have the seasons, the four seasons. In the Southeast, you have the moisture, heat, humidity. And in the Southwest, you have the dry heat. And in the Northwest, you have the extreme cold, severe um, weather conditions, snow, ice, sleet. Now you think about this for a minute. Think that indigenous peoples have lived in these terrains for thousands of years, all of a sudden uprooted and put on different, you know, temperate zones, seasonal, snow, rain, heat, cold. You're not from this environment. You imagine what the physical and psychological toll that will have on you. Well, they did just that with Geronimo. Geronimo was from the dry heat in New Mexico, Arizona. It was constant. It was hot, but it wasn't humid. It was dry heat, and he was sent to Florida. Moisture, a lot of rain. It, his health deteriorated, not just physically, psychologically. He spiraled downward into drunkenness. But the biggest thing was that they were taught each time that they begged the governments they wanted to go home to their lands, they were denied. And then if they had children, their children were forbidden to speak the language. So therefore the indoctrination process began. So here we have a process that was to undermine the future generations and hold them hostage, mentally and spiritually bonded to someone else who didn't have their best interests. Um, what Colonel Pratt set into motion was nothing but a continuation of a psychology that was to be introduced to keep our people blind, deaf, and dumb, to make us believe that we were to become men. In other words, going back to the phrase, or the quote, excuse me, kill the Indian, save the man. When in fact, what they were doing was kill the entire Indian and destroy him as a man, period. Turn him into a servant, because the trades that they were training us for were made, and basically to work in a domestic capacity, and that was it. And we've seen this all the way up into the 50s and 60s, and of course the destitution that came out of that, especially those who lived on reservations. For a time when the government funding, and because of the agents who were supposed to uh, communicate dollars and cents, support to the Indians on the reservations, um, 70 to 80% of that money never reached. And we know that their agents were involved in theft. Basically, they weren't being forthwith with the monies that was the government was supposed to be subsidizing on the reservations. This went on for a very long time. Again, I always say today's based on yesterday, and tomorrow's based on today. So the reasons why we see so much destitution and suffering is because what was done, and basically the reasons why. But getting back to the indoctrination aspect is really difficult, because it's one thing to rob people from the material wealth, resources, things that they need to survive. It's another thing to rob someone of their spirit, of their self-identity. You know, you cut me today, and I'll bleed, I'll hurt. I get a band-aid, hydrogen peroxide, and I'll heal in a couple of days. But you strip me of who I am. And the worst thing is that when I don't even know that I'm supposed to know who I am, and then finding out that was taken from me. You can imagine the suffering. And then those who are being destroyed mentally. You think about the process with the Carlisle School. Children were coming from the reservations because this is what they did. The agents basically took the children away, told them they had to go to school, boarding schools. We know instances where children were never seen again. Children were killed at the boarding schools, molested by priests, Catholic priests, etc. And then these kids, knowing that their parents told them who they were, even against government policy, was that you were not supposed to teach your children a language, whichever indigenous language it was. You were not supposed to do it, but some did anyway. And then when those children went to those boarding schools, forced into that environment, my God, imagine the pain. The teacher, person who's supposed to be educating you, go figure, is telling you you're not to speak Indian. in this classroom or ever again. Here is a white woman or a white man standing in front of a chalkboard telling you, now you are no longer, um, you know, running horse or, a dull knife or whatever your indigenous name was. Your name is now Edward. Um, you get a Christian name. Imagine the psychological damage. That must have created. Could you just sit there and just think about that for a second? Um, I thought about it. I said to myself, well, I've been there. I didn't go to a boarding school. I went to public school. I really don't see much difference, except this time my family's was totally disconnected. You see, it takes more than one generation, maybe I'm saying about a generation and a half, just enough where they get the parents. So once the parents were removed and detached from their cultural line, the language, the name, they don't have to go to boarding schools. They can change the name from boarding school, send them to regular school, because now they are indoctrinated or acclimated, if you will, into a system that is there to destroy them totally. You know, it's how do you tell a people that you're there to make them civilized, but your agents are engaged in theft? There are no real resources, finances to help, to rebuild, to give substance, to give a foundation. A new foundation is what they claimed they wanted for us. But the destitution says a totally different story on the reservations. And even in some indigenous peoples who have acclimated into mainstream society. Some are doing well, yes, but those who are doing well, most are, I wouldn't say all, some are detached from their cultural identity. They have their Christian name. Some of them are proud. Some of them are happy. They don't see that as a negative. But I go back to the old saying, the old Negro song, "No man is an island." We all have to take account and deal with the collective at some time. We all dealt with community at one time, and now it's all about the self, the individual. And if that's the case, then why are people complaining? If we've overcome, if we've transgressed, into a better way of life and thinking, doing, something wrong with that picture. It doesn't quite add up. So we have to explore a little further as to why the idea that killing the Indian and saving the man that they came up with was supposed to enhance our lives. And in fact, it has done just the opposite. So there is a level of misunderstanding and miseducation. We have to get back to something greater that we have lost. So, that aspect, the indigenous aspect of indoctrination, correlates with another part of that equation, which is the black, or should I say black people, or so-called African Americans, so-called Negroes. You know, they say that in 1619, the first slaves were brought to American Jamestown, Virginia. I challenge that assertion. I happen to know that in 1555 there was a slave trader by the name of John Hardy Hawkins who was commissioned by the church, the Catholic Church, to bring into servitude black people. And when the first so-called Africans came here, they realized that they were not atomists, people of strange religion. They wore clothes. Most of them were Muslims. You know, they spoke Arabic. They spoke Arabic. They didn't speak English. Most of them. And a lot of them were scientists, engineers, masons. Oh yeah, I tell you about that part of history is they don't want people to know. They want black people to think that there is no history behind it, just like they wanted to strip indigenous peoples of our history. In order for these conquerors to conquer us, they had to remove that which we stood upon, which was our culture, our way of life, our foundation, our temples, our cities. Yeah, I said cities. Cities. Not all Indians live in teepees. But a city doesn't classify a building. A city is almost a prerequisite, if you will, for being civil, like civilization. Civilization doesn't mean that we have technology, we live in buildings, we live in skyscrapers, and that makes us a civilization. Civilization is as my brother John Henry Clark stated, is the art of being civil. So, city uh, to me means a people and how they live. People want to call this civilization on the outside, but deeply underneath, we are just as primitive as some of the beasts in the field. So, anyway, so when the so-called Africans were kidnapped, they were brought here to build for the Europeans. Now, when the Europeans got here, when the Spanish got here, they found forts, they found cities in South America and in North America. Cities they found. They have since nearly wiped all remnants of these civilizations, but not totally, because they're still unearthing evidence of these cities today. As a matter of fact, they just found some in Georgia, ruins, Mayan ruins from 2011, just last year. Further evidence shows that our people were great. So when the Africans were, so-called Africans were brought here, excuse me for digressing so much, but when they were first brought here to the Americas, so-called Americas, they were demanded of to build. All Africans just didn't pick cotton. Benjamin Banneker designed the Capitol. Go read it. The information is there in the Library of Congress. Benjamin Banneker, a black man. The Capitol building, the designs, the schematics. I mean, Washington, D.C., the whole layout, the White House. Those black people built that stuff. And people here today got nerve to disrespect black people today. All I say this. Yes, we are out of tune. We are out of character. This is my black side talking. Because we don't know who we are. Most of us don't know who we are. If we knew, I guarantee you our people would straighten up. But you see, this knowledge was kept from us purposely, and then we were turned into something other than ourselves. And that's to be what they call us as a nigger. Yeah, I said it. Well, I didn't create that word. The European did. That word just lives in the hearts and minds of those who have been oppressed and destroyed here. Now, the relationship between blacks and Indians with regards to indoctrination is similar. Like the Indians put on boarding schools, when the first Africans were brought here, they realized that those first blacks still knew their language. They still had their names. They still had their ways. So old master had to keep a guard, a lookout, so he could be prepared for whenever he tries to revolt. Because a free black man, especially a Muslim, you're dealing with a people who had a propensity to resist enslavement, particularly Muslims, the black Muslims. And I learned this from the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan. He said that on the slave ships, when the slave captain saw the Muslims on the boat, because Islam brought out the militant propensity in the black man, he was scared. And he separated the Muslims from the other religious beliefs, and they were killed. Yes, this is a fact. It's also in the Library of Congress. So they had the same problem when they got off the boats. Not all of the slave captains did this because they were thinking money. So what they did was they set up what was a processing facility called projects. Stay with me on this. And these projects were set up almost like a small housing community. And what they did was, the children that were born, and this is interesting because the slave master was so cruel, he committed all kinds of vile acts against the black man. He had mothers sleeping with their sons, sisters sleeping with their brothers, and the word mother effer, that's where the term comes from. If those who are listening didn't know that, well, it's sad to say that's where the term comes from. They forced the Africans, the so-called Africans, to have sex with their mothers, the boys, the sons. And the children that were born, they would take them away from their parents and raise them with a white woman. As soon as that baby could hear, not even walk, a white woman called that baby a nigger. That was his name. Now, this was in 1555. Now, they said the first Africans were brought over when? 1619, right? From 1555 to 1619 is 64 years. I don't know if you ever heard of the $64,000 question. It's a Masonic code. You know, um, certain Masons use it. If you know anything about Masonry, if you don't, well, then go study. It was an incubation period that they used. It took them 64 years to create a society of Negroes. They had to separate the African mind from the Negro. So you kill off the African and save the Negro. That's how you rule. And in that process, to make the African afraid, because the so-called Africans were not afraid of their enslavers. Every chance they got, they fought to the death to free themselves. So you figure sometimes on a plantation you have the slave master, his family, and some overseers, a dozen, and they're residing over 40, 20, 30 Africans, so-called Africans. You mean to tell me not even 10 of them said, or one of them said, look, it's only 12 of them. It's 40 of us. So what caused them to be fearful? Well, whenever there was an uprising, a rebellion, or escape, what they did was, whenever the brother or sister were caught, particularly if it was a brother, they'd bring him back, chop his foot off, tie him to 4 horses, and let the horses go. They did this to the women. Sometimes they were pregnant. And if the baby fell out during, they would step on the baby's head with its boot heel. Or sometimes they go into, bear with me, this is difficult to talk about sometimes. They would go, they would go into the slave quarters and pull out the rest of the slaves, bring them out, children and all, babies and all, women and all, spread out a red and white checkered tablecloth, take a meat cleaver, slit the black woman down the middle of her belly, watch the baby fall out on the floor, and then step on the baby with his boot heel. Now, they did this in front of the children. Now, what kind of psychological effect you think that would have on a child to see this white man do this? Stick his hand inside the belly of the pregnant black woman and pull the baby out. Can you? Most of us today, we can't even go into a hospital maternity ward where women are giving birth. I know I could barely sit on, when my child was born. I was strong enough to sit there, but it was definitely a sight that I'll never forget. So imagine a child. So a child's growing up with this fear of this man. This was done instinctively for them to keep us in control. So that incubation period, that 64-year incubation period, indoctrination worked. Now, what does it have to do with Indians? Well, in the Caribbean, Cuba, when they came upon the Spanish, they had their conflicts. The conquistadors, they would take the babies and smash the babies' heads on the trees, throw the babies in the fires, alive, throw the babies to dogs, wild dogs. They did this to the women and the men and the babies. I do this because when you look at the barbarism, the brutality, the Spanish did it, the French did it, the white Americans did it, who were really, white Americans are really the English's brother. The English did it. The Dutch, they were all involved. But again, not digressing, this all corresponds. Black Indian, what was it that they saw that made them fear so much that they had to commit these brutal and vile acts against us? What was it? They coveted our lands, for one. For two, they saw us as a threat to their existence. And three, they were envious. Hmm. So you ask yourself, how could someone be so beastful or maniacal? How could they be barbaric? Well, that's another topic for another day. I'm not going to touch on that, but just wanted to expound on the relationship between our peoples, black and Indians. You know, I'm not going to talk too much about white Indians. Reasons why is because white Indians in this country did not suffer the same fate. And I'll just touch quickly on that. When there was an outbreak of war, the only white Indians that might have suffered the same fate is the ones that were caught in battle. Believe me, excuse me, that there were whites who quickly threw up their hands in the last half hour and said, I'm not Indian, I'm white, I'm white. When they thought that they were going to lose their lives. Oh yeah, we're going to touch on that too. There's some people running around here calling themselves this and calling themselves that, but when it gets hot in the kitchen, people are going to renege on their identity, their so-called identity. You see, being black and brown, you can't run from that. That's always there. But being white, uh, and, and having an identity such as being an Indian, well, when the flames get hot under your feet, let's see where you stand. That's how a lot of people are going to be tested. Hmm. So the indoctrination process between blacks and Indians in this country is similar by degrees. We are still suffering post-traumatic disorders, stress, slave syndrome, indoctrination, post-traumatic indoctrination syndrome. because we're trying to find ourselves. Many black people today who have indigenous blood like myself are looking for a place under the sun. Some people say go back to Africa. Some people don't have the money to go back to Africa. And some people, even if they did, it's like telling somebody who's been living somewhere for so long, you gotta leave. Well, the Creator gave us enough land to share. Some people were just too damn greedy. And that's not a viable option for them. And I'm talking about the ones in power. They don't want to share one red, black piece of dirt, soil, earth to no one. They want to keep it all. All of the golf courses, and coveted lands that they've coveted and stolen and kept for themselves. They will not relinquish, not even an acre. They won't. They didn't put indigenous peoples on a rotten piece of mud, dry mud, for nothing, with the promises of a better life. And seeing just the opposite. It was done that by design. It was no accident. It was intentional. So what do we expect? To that I say, well, leave it into the Great Spirit's hands, as He knows best. With that, I hope that I have managed to give a little clarity to a much needed, discussion, or should I say, much needed information on the topic of that the indoctrination um, between blacks and Indians. Something that a lot of people will talk about. All I hear from both sides is, "Oh, my people were enslaved. Oh, my land was taken." And I say to both sides, we have more in common than we do apart, and that we have suffered immensely. Both have lost lands. Both. One was stolen from the lands. One's lands was stolen. One's identity and language was stolen, and one's identity and language was stolen. Many indigenous peoples, even on reservations, don't know their language. Many Indians living in urban communities completely lost and cut off. Some who were let go by families, put up for adoptions, lost, like myself. Lucky that I was found. Lucky. I thank the Great Spirit every day for my restoration. So we have both suffered. We shouldn't point fingers. We should not point fingers at each other, rather than embrace to help each other to heal, because we have a history together that supersedes and should overlook any things that divide us, which is very, very minute, to say the least. We have been compromised so much as a people, with our numbers being reduced, populations. We should be thinking of rebuilding and forging new alliances with each other. I say to those who don't want to lose their external identities, their appearance, fine. Keep to yourselves. We ain't got no problems with that. We'll keep to ourselves. Black Indians want to unite, and the other indigenous peoples who consider themselves full bloods, they want to unite. Cool. Well, let's network. We have to come to some common ground. In order for us to do that, we have to look back. In order for us to move forward. Um, this will probably be the only part to this um, topic, which I'm going to call the relationship between blacks and Indians and the indoctrination process. And with that, I'm signing out. I'll say, Donada Kohoni, Anigido, peace and blessings. This is Dawado Kuno Khalia Donada Khanagiski of the Cherokee Blackfoot Cultural Circle. And I'm signing out.